right. Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. Happy holidays. Welcome. I'm pleased to call to order this study session on the cost of residential development in San Jose here on the morning of December 8th. We will start with the roll call.
Kamei, Campos,
Present.
Tordios,
Here.
Cohen,
Here.
Ortiz,
Present.
Mulcahy,
Here.
Dwan,
Here.
Candelas,
Here.
Casey, Foley, Mahan.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Great. Thank you, Tony. Well, good morning to everyone and welcome. Thank you to folks who've come together to help educate us on the challenges facing development of housing in our city, a topic we've discussed quite a bit in recent years, and probably strategically one of the biggest challenges we face as a city, because we know investment in housing, housing production, and that balance of housing and jobs is upstream of so many other challenges around affordability and quality of life and people's ability to really have a foothold here in our valley. So I'm going to turn things over to our housing director, Eric Sullivan, and his co-presenters. We'll have the staff presentation, which is very substantive. We'll hear some perspectives from industry experts, and then we will turn to the council for discussion and questions, and then we'll save a little bit of time at the end for public comments. So thanks again, and Eric, I'll let you take over.
Thank you, Mayor. So Eric Sullivan, Director of Housing, and with me today is Jason Moody from EPS and Nicole Graham from CSG Advisors. And I'll just briefly open up this presentation to provide some quick background on this study session and how we reached to this report that we'll be providing out today as presented by Jason and Nicole, provide some important context, and then hand it off to Jason and Nicole to go through. By way of quick framing, we will first go through the market rate cost of residential development analysis, followed by some brief slides on office to residential conversions, and then we will kick it over to Nicole Graham to get into the affordable housing cost of residential development, and then we'll wrap it up from there with our panel as the mayor had articulated. And so first, just to provide some quick context, the CSG and EPS were charged with doing this analysis and getting into a robust data set. And so part of some of the divergences from prior studies just represents the more rich data set that we're able to look at as we began conducting a far more sort of data-driven analysis regarding each of these sides, both market rate and affordable housing. And I will note that part of the differential and part of the data set really comes forward and understanding that there are still limitations to a lot of that data set. And as we begin to think about where we see those limitations and understand the broader context that there's no single study that can capture all the ins and outs of challenges of residential development, but we feel this analysis very much encapsulates a lot of the primary challenges. Leading up to this event, we had a lot of community engagement, getting more impact and reviews and thoughts from both our labor unions, our developers, affordable developers, market rate developers. You'll hear from affordable and market rate developers later today during the panel. And by way of quick context setting, I'll just note a few things here before we dive into the details. First off, in considering just the challenges of forecasting out any cost of residential development, there's always gaps in the data. And so we acknowledge there are some gaps in our data. There's some determinations that we could not reach based on the data set that we looked at. Two, in looking at hypotheticals that are created, we looked at current market costs. We looked at projected costs in particular areas. So we didn't encapsulate all of the cost of development challenges across the entire city. We looked at specific building types across a wide array, and then 4 areas of particular growth within the city. And 3 is we look at considerations for policies of how to address these challenges identified within the cost of the residential development study. I just want to further contextualize that there are some factors that are outside of the city's control. Cost of land, market financing, material and supply chain challenges, which represent the majority of the challenges to cost of development are items outside of city's control. And where we can have impact and where the administration as one team continues to make improvements is areas around policy and programs, around impact fees, taxes, and permitting. And so with that as context, I'll now just quickly summarize the charge to EPS. We asked them to look at the various different types of market rate development, take from that data-rich analysis, both public data and some private data, and underpinning to model out what would, based on 5 particular building types across 4 particular areas of growth within the city, what do we see as challenges coming forth with costs of development, and to ground that in some really difficult data sets and mathematics to see where the challenges are. And after we go through that analysis, there'll be a brief section of slides that I'll jump back in that reflects just a similar perspective of view, but draws from a different data set coming from one of our partners, JLL, who looked at some of their existing deals, just to add essentially bookends to the analysis to have as much robust information as possible to inform decision-making going forward. And so now I'll turn it over to Jason to then go forward from here.
Thank you. Again, Jason Moody. I'm a managing principal at Economic and Planning Systems. It's a firm that's been doing real estate economic analysis in the Bay Area for over 40 years, and I've been with the firm for 30 years. So we work with both public and private sector clients, so we have a pretty good balanced perspective on these issues. And I'm going to be focusing on the market side of the equation. And first, I definitely want to congratulate you for wanting to roll up your sleeves and get into the details. A lot of the slides are very detailed. And so just as a kind of stepping back, so we don't get lost in the details, I want to kind of frame the analysis. First of all, we're looking at the 2024-2025 market, so it's a snapshot. Numbers will change over time. We've used revenue and cost assumptions for our analysis based on third-party sources to, CoStar, Redfin, these are Marshall & Swift, these are various sources that are pretty reliable. But they definitely provide generic estimates. Every project will be different given the unique circumstances. So I think that is an important just kind of framing of our work. And there we go. We also did review development pro formas for recent projects in San Jose, and just to make sure that, that our third-party sources were truth tested, and we found that we're pretty much in the range. I won't go through this in detail, but the EPS pro formas are compared against the pro formas that we reviewed from real projects, and they're all kind of in the range. Again, there is a variability, but in some cases we're a little higher, in some cases we're a little lower. So we believe that the basic numbers are pretty well truth tested. Just a few pictures are always fun on a Monday morning. Wanted to just to describe the type of projects that we've looked at. There's a wide range of projects that are out there, and we have tried to kind of make them more generic and divide them into various categories. We did not look at single-family homes. We looked at, on the for-sale side, we looked at townhomes and stacked flats, as you can see pictures of them right there. Those are kind of relatively simple projects to build. The costs are a little bit lower than normal, and they're relatively lower density, obviously higher density than single family, but lower density than the rental type. And these are for sale, but there's no reason they have to be for sale. This is just the way the market is providing these units when it comes to new construction. So you could technically be renting one of these, but most of the time they build them as for sale units. These are the rental types that we looked at. Again, same caveat here. You could actually build these as condos. You just don't see it much. So we didn't really look at it. These are typically delivered for a variety of financial and institutional reasons as rental product. And we have the podium, which is it's kind of a parking on the ground floor and residential on top of it. The wrap parking is kind of in the middle with the residential wrapped around it. And the tower is the highest density by far of all, 12 stories, steel construction, the most expensive type of product to build, and these are examples of what they look like. And getting into the details on the product types, we really had to make assumptions for each one about density, about the number of units per acre, about the number of stories, in order to put it into our model and provide financial analysis of them. You know, all those factors really do affect the cost. Average unit size, these are all numbers that go into our model, and admittedly, all those numbers are not uniform, but we have to make an assumption for the purpose of quantifying them. And the assumptions we make are pretty generic and in line with what you typically see in San Jose. I won't go through these numbers in detail, but suffice it to say the parking's a big number, important number, and the number of stories. We did look at everything in terms of a 2-acre project, a site, mainly because we wanted to do an apples-to-apples comparison across the product type. So we assumed that you would build on 2 acres. And so on 2 acres, you can see the townhomes, you're going to get about 40 units for a 2-acre site. For the stacked flats, you get about 100, this is the second row, about 106 units. And then the podium and the wrap are kind of similar in terms of the density. And then the tower is the most dense, 470 units. But you can actually go more than that. It's just the example we used. We also have divided up our analysis into various parts of the city because certain things will differ. The 2 things that mostly differ in the city are going to be rents. You get higher rents in certain locations than other locations. And then your impact fees do vary within the city as well. So those are the factors that construction costs really won't vary by location per se. They vary by product type and location. The yellow highlighted areas are the areas that we looked at. And that's mainly because that's where most of the kind of change areas are happening, and most of the type of development we're looking at is occurring in those areas. Again, just to reiterate what Eric said, there's a lot of factors that will affect the feasibility, both on the market value side of the consideration and on the cost side of the consideration. So this is a snapshot that we did, but these conclude mortgage interest rates, land costs, market capitalization rates, prices and rents, obviously really big factors, and then labor costs, construction financing, taxes, et cetera. So because there's all these variables, we did some sensitivity testing to test what happens when you move those variables around to see how that'll affect feasibility, and that's an important part of our analysis. So quickly on the study results, and we'll be coming back to this again and again, but I just want to quickly go over it. I think that from a policy perspective, the biggest issue we're trying to understand relates to Municipal Code Section 1410, which does allow the city to waive certain fees and taxes if it is necessary to achieve financial feasibility for a project. And so what our analysis found at this point, given where we are in the market today, is that the for-sale townhomes and the stacked flats really don't need any assistance at this point in time. And again, that's a general conclusion. There may be projects that do, but for the most part, they shouldn't because of where we are in the market. Those tend to be the lower cost development types. So they can tend to go forward under current market conditions for the most part. But the rental product, the podiums, the wraps, the towers from the market rate projects are negative. They may be eligible for waivers because of this. They just aren't penciling right now. And of course, that is grounded in what you probably see out there. There's not a lot of those new projects coming out of the ground, so our findings are consistent with what we know to be the case. We found, too, that the taxes and fee waivers may be able to tip the scales for some projects because they do represent a significant component, not significant. They can represent around 10% of costs, and so that can tip the scales for some of the projects. But again, lots of variation by location, so that's an important factor. And also, modest improvements in the market conditions will also tip the scales, and we could see the podium and the wrap becoming more feasible if you get reduction in real development costs or increases in rents in the range of 5 to 15% could change the dynamics. The tower is going to require a significantly more substantial change in market conditions before that becomes an achievable product type. We're thinking more in a 10 to 35% range on the price side, or that could also be achieved through reduction in costs, or a combination of those two. So quickly, I want to talk a little bit about the framework of our analysis, the development feasibility framework. The visual is kind of a very simplistic portrayal of what we look at, and it's very simple. Our analysis is like, what's the value of the project? How much does it cost to build it? And that if the value is higher than the cost, then you have a positive residual land value. The term residual land value is one we keep coming back to. It's really essentially what the land is worth before you develop anything on it. So, and the project value is really a function of prices and rents. Sale prices for sale and rents for the rental product. The project costs, again, excludes land for our purposes of our analysis, really is a function of hard costs, which is the vertical development, the materials and the labor. The soft costs, which is referred to as things like architecture and design and marketing and financing and a lot of soft costs that we throw the contingency in there, and so those are real costs, but they're not. They come in before you actually start developing. The third factor that we look at is fees, taxes and fees. So you got hard costs, soft costs, taxes and fees. Taxes and fees are the ones that you have some control over. You really don't have too much control over the other ones, and so that's why we divide them up in that way. Maybe I'll say one thing. You may have some control over the hard costs, depending on how you deal with prevailing wage. So essentially, those are the assumptions that go into residual land value. And so we use residual land value throughout, and just so you know what it is a lot of developers have other metrics that they use, but this is kind of a very well-accepted metric and one that allows us to make apples-to-apples comparisons across project types. And here is the results of this analysis across location and by product type. And the red indicates a negative outcome. In other words, the residual land value for a 2-acre site is negative. On the non-red, all on the for sale product, is a positive result. So I won't get too focused on the specific results, but you can see it's not working right now. And this graph is assuming no fee waivers, no changes that the city is just requiring folks to do, pay all the city's fees and taxes. Now, I won't get into the details of this. This is the detailed hard cost number. I think the most important thing to take away from this, hard costs generally represent about maybe 65 to 70% of a project's total cost. Broken down within the hard cost, you have materials and supplies and labor. Labor is about 30 to 35% of hard costs. Now, that number can vary, but it's a kind of a good rule of thumb. The materials is the rest of the hard costs. But again, hard costs are not total costs. Hard costs are just about 70% of the total cost. So within the hard cost numbers, big drivers of that are parking is a really big one, and then obviously this type of project that you're building. The hard costs for the tower are much more expensive than the hard costs for the lower density products, because the lower density is primarily wood versus you getting into concrete and steel as you get into higher density, and that's just more technical work, more expensive labor costs, and more expensive materials. The city impact fees and taxes, again, as I mentioned, that's a big part of the equation. This is a kind of a quick summary. As you see, there's a range there because there is differences by location and by product type. But the range is, between 6 and 10% of total project costs, or about $37,000 to $72,000 a unit. So that's not insignificant, but it is what it is. When we look at how you compare from other cities, you're actually you're pretty competitive. So I don't think your taxes and fees are inordinately high relative to your neighbors, your immediate neighbors. You're all on the lower end. This is the townhome, so you're a little bit on the lower end. The brown is the school fees, and the dark purple is your fees. You don't really control the school fees, but you certainly control the purple part. And this is the podium side of the equation. Again, similar thing. you're competitive. There's something on the bottom here that Eric suggested we throw in there, which is the average rent per square foot, and it kind of shows you, while your fees are lower than your neighbors, kind of has to be because your rents are lower than your neighbors too. So the rent's the big factor in the value of a project, the marketability of a project. So if you had really high fees and very low rents, that's almost a non-starter. So you do need to be on the lower end just because you don't have the same the market rents that you can achieve in these other markets. So here is the same graph I showed you earlier, but it's showing you if you waived all the fees, not the school fees because you can't waive those, but all the other fees. And it shows you that by doing that in today's market, you actually can switch a couple of the product types into the positive, depending on in the location where the rents are a little higher in West and downtown and Central District. And you can maybe in some cases move the needle, as we said, and make some of those projects feasible in today's market. You really wouldn't be able to move the needle in the tower because that's just, there's too many other factors involved in that feasibility equation that you can't really affect it materially. Again, you don't need to do anything for the for sale product at this point in time. This graph is kind of showing you the same outcome, but it's showing you, and this is for townhomes and stacked flats, so I don't want to spend too much time on that because there's no problem here, but it's just showing you that you're getting about $525 residual land value per unit for the townhome and $80 for the stacked flats, and it's kind of showing you as the prices go up, the residual land value goes up, which is a pretty obvious relationship. Now this is the equation for the higher density, and you can see here that it's not as good. You need the monthly rent on the bottom and the residual land value on the left on the vertical axis shows you that we're a negative territory in the current environment. So you need to move up to a higher level of around $4.20 per monthly rent per square foot before you get into positive territory. So this is a visual portrayal of the earlier table. Cost reductions can also help you in the reduction in the feasibility equation. So one was rents. This is another look at it from a cost perspective. And here is just kind of for a typical project, 10% reduction in the cost for a podium, 8% reduction in the cost for a wrap. Those will actually yield you a feasible result. But 30% reduction for tower. So that's kind of where we are right now. And that's a pretty hard reduction. That's a big drop in costs. A lot's going to have to happen before those costs come down by 30%. I mean, so it's going to be a combination of both prices, rents, and costs to get the tower to work. Got to move them both in a different direction. Okay. Did I just look at this? Yeah, I think let me see. Yeah, okay, it didn't go forward. Okay, there we go. So now I'm just going to get into drilling down a little bit on the impact fees. We won't spend too much time on the slide, just to say that your impact fees vary by location and by product type. And your primary fees are your inclusionary in lieu fees, your parkland fee, and your school fees. And then you also have construction taxes. And so that's just a kind of a summary of all those. If you want to review that later or ask questions, we can come back to it. So development impact fees by location. This is not a comparison across cities. This is just within your own city. The central area has the highest fees, and the townhomes actually pays a higher per unit fee than the other product types. The tower is actually a lower per unit fee, which is probably good. Other soft costs, as I mentioned, soft costs are around 30% of the total, so this is actually a really big, important factor in feasibility. You have architecture and engineering, you have permits and fees. Those are different than impact fees. We're talking about, those are the building fees, are much lower cost. You have taxes during construction, you still have to pay property taxes and other taxes, and when you're doing, you have financing costs, which has gone up a lot lately because of interest rates. It's a big number, actually it's the biggest number on the table, financing, it's a big one. Insurance, big issue these days, particularly for the for sale product, is becoming more onerous number. And then, marketing and leasing is just kind of, that's pretty obvious. And we throw developer fee and contingency into the soft costs. And then now we're looking at average rents by location, and we compared our analysis with the city's. It has its own study that they do on this topic regularly, and on the far right is the numbers from your own study, and the left is the ones that we looked at. And again, we're kind of in the range. We looked at it by every location. Your study is kind of a citywide look, so we're consistent. Rents comparisons by, this is getting back to the point we made earlier, rents comparisons by neighboring jurisdictions. You tend to be a little lower across the board by product type. It does look like your stack flats competitive, but the rest of them, you're lower than your neighbors. So that's, again, comes back to that feasibility issue here in San Jose. It's more of it's good to have low cost because people can afford it. It's kind of a catch-22. You don't want costs to go up too high because that makes it unaffordable. But that's where you stand right now from your neighbor's a competitive market perspective. So quick takeaways on the market rate housing analysis. Townhomes and stack flats feasible under current market conditions. The multifamily podium are infeasible, but fee waivers may be able to make some projects feasible. Overall, San Jose remains pretty cost competitive from a fee perspective and also from a rent perspective. And I just jumped too quickly. I'm going to go quickly back to, office to residential conversions. This topic is getting a lot of attention these days, and it's mainly because the pandemic really did hurt the office market significantly. And so there's a lot of offices that are underperforming. At the same time, the pandemic hurt downtowns, and downtowns are underperforming. So there's this potential there for kind of a win-win where you might be able to convert these antiquated office buildings that don't have a lot of tenants, aren't achieving, and make them into residential, and then also provide more vitality to downtown. So it's kind of a really, you can see why this idea is getting a lot of attention. It makes a lot of sense intuitively. But the fact is it's not really as simple as, this makes sense, because there's a lot of intricacies involved in a successful conversion that we need to consider. The main things being the building's physical attributes, the market and financial factors, and then the kind of local regulatory framework for whether or not you can actually do this or not. Those are the three things that we looked at. In terms of physical determinants, we can get into this in more detail, but it's really about the shape and configuration of the building. How deep is it? How many windows are the windows? Did the windows all need to be replaced? How high are the ceilings? Where are the columns? All these things, as you can imagine, make sense, and it does relate to code too, because you really don't want to have a bedroom without a window. You don't like having interior bathrooms. These things all affect. You would like to have operable windows. So a lot of offices just are not well equipped for that type of stuff. So they just are not lend themselves. Generally speaking, the newer office buildings with all glass, those are just going to be harder to convert from a physical perspective. They were built as offices. They weren't built as residential buildings. The older buildings tend to have some qualities that might make them more amenable to this from just a physical perspective. I won't get into the detail, but these are just two examples, and we can, if you guys want to come back to this, we can, about what makes a good building versus a challenging candidate for an office conversion. But again, the one on the left is kind of an older building. It looks like, that could actually, you could see that becoming a residential. One on the right would be harder to convert. The market factors is, I think, in a nutshell, generally speaking, in normal markets, office rents on a per square foot basis are much higher than residential rents. That's just the way it's been for a very long time. So for an owner to say, I'm going to convert to residential, they've kind of given up on the office market. They're like, it's never going to come back. So I'm going to go for the next best use, which is residential. Even though we know that residential rents per square foot aren't as high as office, at least I can get someone in there and fill it up and get some revenue. But there's a lot of offices, particularly the new offices, they're still holding up holding out hope that the office market's going to come back and they're going to get those higher rents. So that's a big financial, whether they may have a lot of, they might not have a lot of debt. They may be able to hold it. They can ride out the period. Sometimes you have a owner that's in distress. They basically go bankrupt, and then the bank takes it over, and they can do a little bit more with it. They can start making moves. But if an owner can hold out, and they probably will hold out. And I think another big factor, just financially, is this is a new concept, and which means there's more risk and uncertainty, and so the lenders and investors are a little more cautious about financing a conversion project. That's just they don't have enough test cases, comparables to make them feel comfortable about whether something is going to be feasible or not. The policy levers here, there are some policy levers in your disposal. There are some, obviously, state life and safety requirements that you can't do much about, but you can obviously do things about impact fees, parking, open space and amenity requirements that designed for residential may not be applicable to these office buildings, and you can waive those, and then the streamline approval. So there are some things, and some building and code stuff that you can do that could move the needle on some of those projects. So takeaways on this office conversion concept: we didn't model it because it's so hard to model, because the costs can vary significantly depending on the building. So it's really a case-by-case look. So we don't have any broad conclusions to say, oh, this will work always or it won't work. Targeted interventions can make some feasible, and so I do think it's a worthwhile endeavor to kind of identify and quantify opportunities for this in San Jose and think about where it might happen, because it could be a win-win in certain circumstances. And now I'm turning it back to Eric.
Great, thank you, Jason. And so to provide for this next set here, what we asked, as Jason and I have both mentioned, doing a hypothetical modeling around these costs of development doesn't capture all things. And so we wanted to provide just a similar approach, but based on a different data set that was brought forth that JLL had did, and to share that with you, because you'll see a lot of similar trends as what Jason had described, but a different set of cost factors, because they looked at sort of an existing set of deals that they have done within the area. And some of the key takeaways from the marketplace that JLL had shared are the following. The first is that overall, as everyone knows, the Silicon Valley has a much higher, incomes across the board, as we're the center of tech, and tech is having quite a run just in the last couple of years, particularly around the work of AI. But two, with that take also comes some inherent challenges, and that is looking at how best and how reliant that the region is on tech, and therefore a heavy dependence there. And so that is just a cause of just concern. Three, and within the broader context here, is looking at what is the impacts of those industries, those high incomes, on our residential market, and thinking about sort of what is the history and challenges within Silicon Valley that has a history of undersupplying housing. So we have high incomes and high-tech firms that continue to grow, but we're still underperforming in our overall production of housing. And then that continuing supply challenges create some of the challenges that we're seeing today, as Jason had walked through regarding the cost of development. So as we look at ways in which we continue to have both lower-income homes as well as higher-income households and the challenges that those markets present, it creates a real high barrier to home ownership. One of the understandings from the analysis is, as we looked at the growth of townhomes, is that you'll see in some of the rent analysis is that we don't have a lot of home ownership product that's coming new to the market. We have historically, nearly 70% of single-family homes, but as more of those families kind of transition, as new families come in at higher incomes, that transition from rental to home ownership, that continues to be a gap, particularly for middle-income households. And then lastly, as we continue to see some of those continued impact growth, rent growth, as Jason had mentioned, on the market rate side, continues to be relatively stagnant. So JLL then took this analysis and said, okay, based on the similar set of hypotheticals, your wraps, your podiums, and your towers/high-rises, where do we need to see the growth in rents in order for these projects to have essentially market affordability and feasibility? with limited action taking from the city. And what they've shown here is a projection that says, based on year-over-year inflationary increases of roughly 3%, which is right. If you look at our housing quarterly reports that we produce and you compare Q3 2021 market rate rents to Q3 2025 market rate rents, it's just a little bit above 3% year-over-year inflation. So that's typically how San Jose has grown on the market rate side in terms of market rate rents. So based on that steady growth of just year-over-year inflation, we would get to feasibility for a wrap a couple years out. So we're a little behind because, as Jason had mentioned, our market rate rents don't see that continuous and more robust growth as we see in our neighboring municipalities. In addition, if you start looking at that for podium builds, your more structured builds, you can see that that cost per square foot, again, assuming that standard 3% inflationary growth, that brings us sort of into natural feasibility of these projects without any actions from the city, closer to 9 or 10 years out, based on that growth of per square foot market rents. And then our most complex builds are high-rise / our towers. Again, a bookend here to understand sort of the challenges of the two cost factors going into this. Your growth in your rents and your residual land values. That's inclusive of that project cost. There are some challenges here in order to get, towers within our downtown to come forward. And this is part of, the sort of an alternative view based on a data set, again, limited to just the data set that JLL had, but it shows on a bookend perspective that our growth areas within downtown for towers is certainly challenged, and we'll need to consider some of the policy considerations going forward where possible to address and spur some more of those projects into construction. And so that's a quick summary. So the takeaway here is that as we think about on the market rate side, the work that the administration is doing, one on the 4-year plan that Chris Burton is leading, how do we then think about sort of the different factors that go into this in wanting to spur more new construction, more of the tower, more higher density product, as well as continuing the growth of some low density project that has market feasibility today in our townhomes and wraps. 2, we'll be bringing forth on Housing Day on January 27th, updates to the inclusionary housing ordinance, as well as our incentive programs we have for the multifamily areas incentives, our downtown incentive program, our conversations around how best to spur some office residential conversions for those projects that fit. So there are different policy aspects that, as I mentioned at the outset of the presentation, that we can take to try to spur some of these actions into construction. And then 3, the continuing work of the focus areas. As we have the building more housing focus area, the work that PBC is doing around land use and policy, the work we're doing around development services, and then how best we are creating stronger bridges between land and capital to spur some of these projects going forward. And so that's the quick summary of the market rate side. And now, as we're tracking just about on time here, I'm going to make a transition over to our affordable housing side and what are some of the challenges we'll see in that space. And so going forth here, similar to how we charged the EPS with the task, we asked CSG to do a similar kind of review. Some of their quick findings you'll see kind of labeled on this first slide, and Nicole Graham from CSG will kind of take us through some of this analysis. You'll see some very brief summary of some of the takeaways you'll see. One is, our affordable housing costs are fairly consistent within the Bay Area. You'll also see that we also produce far more affordable housing comparison to our neighbors. Our square footages tend to be a bit smaller and a little more costly because of our shift to more special needs, particularly homeless housing units in the last few years. And our per unit costs reflect some efficiencies. You'll see some takeaways coming forward on the affordable housing side. The mid-rise development, the 4 to 6 stories, that tends to be the type of product that comes forward within the affordable housing space with, again, a strong leniency towards ELI units, which the city has produced far more than our surrounding neighbors. And then fourth here, it represents just a much broader share in the Bay Area of our affordable housing product. We have seen a significant growth in the spur and the development of affordable housing in the city. More needs to be done. But as CSG jumped into this analysis, they looked for a much more robust data set than we've done in prior years with this study to get a better understanding of grounding this analysis and those takeaways. And so what you'll see here is a lot of the numbers that were pulled were at the time of tax credit application, which again has a variance to when a project actually comes out of the ground or gets to construction completion. So there'll be some variances, and Nicole will talk through that. And three, a lot of the city and the county focused on building housing for special needs, high need populations and homeless housing. And so that's where you'll see some of the variances of our higher per square foot costs. We've done a lot of work within the space over the last couple of years in building out more ELI affordable units, with certainly more work to be done. And so now I'll turn it over to Nicole Graham from CSG.
Great, thank you. Just want to make sure I have this working. Okay, good morning. I'm Nicole Graham with CSG Advisors, and as mentioned, we prepared the affordable housing component of the cost of development study. So today I will walk you through what was a lot of data and trying to distill that down to some key conclusions about development costs in San Jose for affordable housing developments and how that compares to the rest of the region. So getting started, across California, we reviewed data from 194 proposed new construction projects. These are all affordable housing developments. These are tax credit applications that are submitted to TCAC, the allocating agency. And those applications comprise over 20,000 units. So it's a pretty robust data set. And about 20% of those units originated from Santa Clara County. So about 4,200, 4,300 units in Santa Clara County were among these applications. Those applications for Santa Clara County we brought in from 2023 to 2025. And the balance of the applications that we pulled were from the rest of the Bay Area and also Sacramento, Los Angeles, and San Diego counties, just to provide a point of comparison elsewhere in the state. The applications provide really a wealth of information about where the project is, housing type, units, square footage, a breakdown of development cost, a breakdown of funding sources, operating expenses. These are very detailed applications. So we were fortunate and able to getting a lot of that information. We did also have access to some cost data for older projects in the city. We ended up excluding those because they were just a little too old. We didn't feel that they were representative. Okay, so as mentioned already, right, all of this information comes from these applications. And this is important because applications are submitted usually around 6 months before construction even begins. And so that means that these are not final construction budgets, and they're certainly not actual as-built costs. And that's the big limitation of the data, right? So things are going to move a bit between the time of application and project completion. And in fact, in our practice, advising on thousands of developments, we often tell people that the only thing that we know with 100% certainty about any project budget is that it's going to be different than the final costs, right? It's usually a little bit higher, sometimes it could come in lower, but it's always different. And so using this application stage data, though, gives us a couple major benefits. First, we get a much larger sample size with nearly 200 projects statewide, from which we can see trends and distinctions among the projects. And then the second benefit of using this data source is that every jurisdiction is using the same application template, right? So this is very different than if we're looking at individual developer proformas where people, one developer might report things one way, they might collapse certain costs onto a single, cost category in ways that another project doesn't. So it's much harder to draw sort of apples to apples comparison among those projects if we were taking things from multiple sources. So having a single source where everyone does it the same way is a much better way to draw conclusions. And let's see. The one thing we want to note is that, as I mentioned, we were bringing in projects from 2023 and 2024, as well as applications submitted through mid-year this year. But we wanted to make sure that we were treating all of those applications the same. So we did escalate costs from 2023 and 2024 projects to $2025 to keep things consistent. Which makes sense because costs are rising, but they're going to rise everywhere. So that's going to be similar for San Jose or Oakland or Los Angeles. Another note is that our numbers that we provide, we're going to be referring to total development costs per unit and per square foot, per net square foot. These costs exclude acquisition. And so I want to point that out because, of course, acquisition is a key cost. The reason we pull it out from our numbers is because that information is reported very differently among applications. So particularly if land is provided by a local government, which is quite common, or is publicly owned for another reason, right? The value of that might come in as like $1 or some very minimal amount. And so it's not a great thing to average out across projects. And finally, the reported costs may not include some additional fees that are triggered by city funding contributions. So while the application should include the full cost or the full expected cost, there may be some costs that those aren't capturing. Okay, now let's get into the findings. So we will look at San Jose's costs from several angles, per net square foot, per unit, and by housing type. And we'll be comparing that to the rest of the Bay Area as well as to key areas in California. So here, we're looking at San Jose's development costs in the context of the broader Bay Area. What this chart shows, pretty clearly here, right, we see San Jose on the far left, and the average cost per net square foot of about $1,050 sits right in the middle of the regional jurisdictions, right? We see Solano comes in quite low at $840. It's really an outlier here, and we'll get to that as we go through. And Contra Costa and Sonoma, close to $1,000 per net square foot. San Mateo and Santa Clara, very close to the San Jose average of $1,050. And Santa Cruz and Alameda, a little higher, right, $1,141 and $1,215 respectively. And then there's San Francisco at $1,440 per net square foot. It's an outlier similar to Solano, just on the other end, right? So those two really bookend the rest of the counties, which have a lot less variability between them. As a note, no applications were submitted in Marin County during the time period that we looked at, so we don't have Marin included for that reason. Now, the data shows that the San Jose's costs mirror the Bay Area construction environment as a whole. And in fact, if San Jose were its own county, it would rank as the 4th lowest in the Bay Area if we're looking at these, net costs per square foot at the top here. So in this top chart, we're showing each of the counties organized from the lowest cost per net square foot to the highest. And in the bottom chart, now we're switching to per unit, and we've maintained the order of counties, but you can see things go up and down, right? So there we're a little bit all over the place. And San Jose's per unit costs now, on a per unit basis, align more closely with Alameda and Solano. And on a per unit basis here, it's ranking 2nd lowest behind Alameda. So it's interesting, right? We see that Alameda has the lowest cost per unit, but the 2nd highest cost per net square foot. So it just sort of demonstrates how things are, those don't align. And there's a really good reason for that, right? So these differences across the Bay Area are just driven much more by the product type and the unit size really than by city-specific conditions. So as we go to the next slide, right here, we can really see why the per square foot costs vary as they do compared to the per unit cost. And it's here we've overlaid the unit sizes on top of the per unit cost data. And so this relationship becomes really clear, right? Which is that the smaller the unit, the average unit, the higher the cost per square foot. It's not a perfect relationship, but it's real close. So San Francisco and Alameda, with the smallest average unit sizes, around 530 to 570 square feet, those counties are also the ones with the highest cost per square foot. Solano, with the largest average unit size, right, we saw previously that one shows the lowest cost per net square foot. And San Jose is right in between, right? The average net square footage is quite a bit smaller than a suburban family development, but larger than an urban SOR style project like those in San Francisco. Overall, San Jose does produce more small units, studios, and 1-bedrooms than a lot of the other jurisdictions. And that tends to raise the cost per net square foot, because all of those units, whether it's a 500 square foot unit or a 900 square foot unit, they all need a kitchen and a bathroom, and those are the highest cost components in the unit. So that is what really drives the result, which is that the smaller the unit, the higher the cost per square foot. And let's see. So now we'll look a bit more at the composition of what is being built. San Jose developments have more units per project. This was an interesting finding, that on average, 173 units per development being proposed, which is quite a bit higher than the Bay Area average of about 112, and the 113 unit average across the jurisdictions and applications that we studied. So that's a meaningful difference and does help explain some of the relatively efficient cost per unit numbers that we see in San Jose. As mentioned previously, right, San Jose produces a higher share of studios and 1-bedrooms, about 66% of all units, compared with 55% across the Bay Area. That's driven in part by the focus on supportive housing, also available funding tools, but really it underscores as well why the per net square foot costs in San Jose are going to look like they do, right? So smaller units are being built in this city. Now, this slide breaks out the components of the costs. So here we're widening our lens beyond to include, we're including beyond the Bay Area, right? We include here San Diego, Sacramento, Los Angeles, and we see that San Jose's total development cost of about $675,000 per unit is really in a very normal range here, right? So it is lower than the Bay Area average of $770,000 per unit, but remember that much of that is based on the size of units being developed and a lack of economies of scale that results when from the developments comprised of fewer units. So in San Jose, because there are larger units developed at a given time, that helps drive down that cost per unit number. Yet San Jose's costs are certainly markedly higher than those in Sacramento, Los Angeles, or San Diego. Again, that's just sort of a known difference between the Bay Area and elsewhere in California. And we can also see just different composition, right? The hard costs are about $484,000 per unit in San Jose. That's a result of the type of developments being built in San Jose. Lots of studios, one bedrooms, and larger projects. And then other costs, such as soft costs, financing reserves, and developer fee, those also track pretty closely between jurisdictions. So again, pretty consistent story here. San Jose does not appear to be an outlier from the data that we reviewed. And let's see, this last data slide breaks out cost per square foot by housing type. And here again, a few things jump out. So first, San Jose's cost per net square foot is lower than the Bay Area average for all of the different project type categories, right? So large families, special needs, seniors, non-targeted, SRO. There aren't SRO projects included from San Jose or Santa Clara, but in all of these other cost categories, they do come in lower for the San Jose developments that were submitted during this time. And second, what drives San Jose's overall profile, their cost profile, is the mix of what's being built here, right? So two product types really dominate. The non-targeted housing at about $1,100 per net square foot, and large family housing at about $938 per net square foot. And remember, again, like those large family housing units will be lower because the units are larger. Together, these two project categories, large family and non-targeted, account for 94% of the square footage represented in these applications. So this is really the story, is that these two types of developments are really driving the cost conclusions that we're making. And that's going to change, right? One thing that we did see in going back to past studies, right, is the composition of projects changes from year to year. So it's not, our conclusions may be different on different, for several different reasons, but one of those is just the nature of projects submitted in any given year. And that's going to be itself a result of other things that may be happening related to funding availability and chasing points in applications and trying to make sure that you're meeting your private activity bond limitations, right? So there are so many different things that go into what developments are going to be proposed. But looking across the jurisdictions, right, we see that those two cost categories that comprise most of San Jose's projects are also the lowest cost categories wherever we look, right? So in the Bay Area, across the state, large family and non-targeted are the lowest cost per square foot. The large family ones, we've sort of discussed why that is, right? The higher the square footage of the unit, right? The more efficient, the more space that you have that is not high cost, right? So you're adding a bedroom, and the marginal cost of adding a bedroom is quite low. But the non-targeted housing, right, also tends to be lower across many jurisdictions. And those projects tend not to have additional requirements of special populations. So they avoid costs of extra space, extra services, extra operating reserve needs that are required to earn the points and get an allocation of that particular housing type. And then another conclusion from here we found is that, right, San Jose, compared to the county, right, is providing 100% of the senior and non-targeted. So all of the applications submitted for Santa Clara County in those categories were from the city. So the city is definitely contributing a high share of the region's affordable pipeline in those counties. In those categories. And then, let's see, compared again with Sacramento, Southern California, of course, San Jose is undeniably higher cost, but that's a Bay Area story, not a San Jose specific issue. Eric, did you want to do anything? Okay, so key takeaways, right? So I think we sort of covered this a few times, but just to run it home, right? The cost of affordable housing development in San Jose really tracks well with other Bay Area counties. We see a story here that makes sense based on the developments being built, or at least proposed, and that makes sense. We also see a high cost per net square foot that's driven again by the smaller average unit size in San Jose. So when we compare that across, again, it appears to make sense from our perspective. And then also San Jose represents a large share of affordable housing developments in the Bay Area. And so I will turn it now over to Eric. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. And so we've provided a lot of detail and analysis. I'll just kind of bring it back up, to a 10,000-foot level. Overall, what we're looking at today as we think about this on the housing continuum is we're on the sort of the right end of this continuum. Our blocking of rent-restricted and rent-stabilized units, our PSH units, and the different financing programs that we have across that entire unit set, and then on our market rate side and our homeownership side, and the small set of programs that we utilize to incentivize development there. And that's what we're kind of focused on within this cost of development for residential development study. Additionally, a lot of the work that we're doing collectively as administration and as a team is furthering under our building more housing focus area, continues to look at, as I had mentioned early on in the presentation, our land use policy and regulations, and a lot of the work being driven forward under that focus area and the focus area scorecard, as well as looking at the areas in which we have, how we're meeting our housing needs with our long-term goal, and what are the ways in which we make continuous improvements through the work of the focus area around development services, and then how do we expand and continue to find more mediums for linking capital and land, and the different types of programs that we'll be bringing forward specifically on January 27th when we have a series of policy initiatives coming forward to council. And so and this is just a quick summary of the timeline overall as we look at the work. As I mentioned, in January 2026, we'll have the IHO come forward, as well as incentive programs, the multifamily housing bond policy, so a number of initiatives to begin taking the information and the data set garnered from today and putting that into some practice beginning in January. In spring, we will have an update of the focus area for building more housing, followed by June, the continuing work that PBCE is doing around the general 4-year plan. And then in August, just the Planning Commission transmits its recommendation on the 4-year plan to City Council. So this analysis that we provided today on the market rate side, then on the affordable housing side, is a good foundation setting for the work we have coming forward in 2026. And so that's the quick summary, and we'll end it there. The appendix, as you see throughout the presentation, is just some additional data and analysis. We won't go through that as we'll begin now our transition to our panel. We'll take a brief minute.
Great. Thank you all very much. That was very enlightening. We'll just take a moment to switch who's in the box. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll just quickly introduce our panel, and then we will, it will make a few comments themselves. So with me joining us in the box today is Joshua Burrows from Urban Catalyst, Ji Lee from Alpha X. There are two representatives of market rate development. And on the affordable housing side, we're on to be joined today by Nevada Merriman from Mid-Penn Housing and Andrea Osgood from Eden Housing. And I'll pass it off first to Josh, and then we'll go around.
Thank you, Eric. And Council, Josh Burrows, Urban Catalyst. We have 300 units under construction here in downtown West and 900 units processing through entitlements and growth areas here. I've also been involved in the delivery of multiple high-rises in downtown San Jose. I've participated in this housing discussion in various forums over the past 15 years with multiple councils. I appreciate staff and the consultants for their work on this study update, and I concur with their key takeaways. This is an extremely critical point in time, and council's direction will have a lasting impact on the growth trajectory of our housing future here. I'm happy to opine further in the Q&A, but I'd like to share some random insights into both our market and also the study to spur discussion. I've always said that San Jose does a great job in housing production in general compared to our neighboring cities on a volume basis. However, when you do look at the RENA numbers on a per capita basis, our neighbors are producing 5 to 10 times the amount of housing per capita than we do. That's a local metric. It's just something to think about in context. Our neighboring cities have some same construction costs, pretty much same land price, pretty similar impact fees and taxes as you've seen. However, they do have 20 to 30% higher rents, 2 times the sales prices for townhomes, and that affects investment here, and that was mentioned in the study. Rents have basically flatlined here in San Jose. That was also shown in the study. Right now, there's some really bad comps and foreclosures hitting our submarket on rental projects. These are projects that were built for, let's call it $650,000 per unit, and they're selling now at $450,000 a unit. There's news projects as well that are being sold for less than the loan amount on the construction loan. That means that all the investors' cash was wiped out, and the bank is taking a haircut to offload the project. This happened to us as well back when we had for sale condos downtown and high rises. The last ones that were delivered were in 2007 and 2008, if you don't count Silvery Towers. That's a really long time ago, and it's a great example of what creating a negative cycle can look like. So I just want to provide that context of kind of like what's going on the rental side that affects investment in our city, or folks that want to invest and deploy capital. There's only a handful of market rate developers breaking ground, which I think is bad for a city of our size. Having 4 to 5 projects breaking ground is not a bellwether for a huge increase in housing production. My opinion is there should be a dozen projects going on major projects going on in each district in our city, specifically in a city that has 90% of its land as single-family homes. Construction costs have somewhat stabilized. This is a subject of this study over the past years. So I just want to say that that's not like the highlight of the study this year. It's pretty much stabilized post-COVID as far as supply chain and materials. So that's a good thing. The study talked about different variations of non-high-rise product, whether it's 4 to 8 stories. I know they studied 2-acre sites. I will say that probably the maximum density you can get on an 8-story building is kind of like what we're doing, 350 units per acre. That's where this would be maximum. So this is where you do like automated parking on the first floor, parking only on the first floor, then you have a full 7 stories of residential. So we're doing that on our projects. Not a lot of people do that. I'd say standard maximum is probably 250 units per acre, where people do like 3 stories of parking and then 5 stories of residential. However, not that many people do 8-story buildings. They typically do 4 to 6, and you see that on the affordable side as well. We're still seeing fees that are on a per unit basis in the city. This means it's not agnostic to unit size or the amount of humans actually creating the impact of a fee living in a unit. So it's the same fee whether one person lives in a studio or 10 people in a 10-bedroom apartment, for example. Another recommendation is looking at deferment of fees to certificates of occupancy. When the actual impact happens, humans move into a building, that's when the impact happens. That's another recommendation. And then property taxes. Close to half of the operating expenses for market rate projects are property taxes. They're one of the biggest drivers to return on cost, which is how you attract investors and banks. Happy to talk more about the state of Washington's program and what they did on this subject to spur 424 projects and build close to 50,000 housing units in their state. And then lastly, AI is happening and growing here, a little bit in our city, definitely in our neighboring cities, as you see millions of square feet get leased up by AI companies. One of our goals as a market rate developer is to keep the tech worker out of our existing Class B and Class C apartment housing stock, which San Jose has a robust amount of, but we need to continue to build market rate to house those workers so they stay out of that product and keep them naturally affordable. Thank you.
Thank you. Gia Lee with Alpha X RE Capital. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I appreciate the chance to offer perspective that represent the small and medium-sized infill community working in San Jose established neighborhood. I think the analysis is really valuable, but there's a key distinction between the study and assumption and also the reality of the infill development in San Jose. The study evaluates the feasibility using 2-acre site, which for townhome, I think that's for a lot of larger builders, because those are allowing larger builders to achieve lower vertical and horizontal construction costs, bulk pricing for material and labors, and much lower soft cost per unit. And however, this does not reflect land supplies or the projects we're looking at in San Jose established neighborhoods. Most R1 and R2 parcels are around 6,000 to 20,000 square feet, about 0.14 and 0.46 acres. Even when lot are combined, typical infill site remain under 0.5 acres. And this scale, realistically, capacity for this type of parcels are 6 to 15 units, even when using innovative tools like small lot subdivision, duplexes, fourplexes, and ADU condo conversions, and some of newly adopted state laws that are supporting starter homes. The smaller infill sites facing very difficult, different development conditions than a 2-acre site. Larger builders do not pursue very small projects, such as 10-unit single-family or smaller lots product around $20 million in revenue, or even a 30, 35 townhome project are too small for them. Those sites are too small to support their operational structures, staffing, and financial models. As a result, only the builders who can take on those parcels, small and medium-sized infill developer who do not have access to large-scale purchasing power and production efficiencies. Those construction costs on small sites are significantly higher because they cannot secure bulk material pricing, as I mentioned earlier. In addition to the traditional townhomes, we're also designing starter home product, homes that are affordable by design, with smaller living area, efficient layout, and high quality designs. Those units are tended to meet the needs of first-time home buyers, younger families, and essential workers who are currently priced out of the market. However, the per unit fee structure becoming a disproportionately heavy burden on those smaller homes. When each unit is moderate in size and designed to be more attainable, applying the same fixed impact fee per unit as large high-cost homes can undermine the entire purpose of delivering naturally affordable starter homes. The cost really means the feasibility assumption based on a slightly larger scale development that doesn't apply to the smaller parcels and are mostly commonly found in the San Jose established neighborhood. Without adjustment, the city is leaving thousands of potential gentle density homes and starter homes unrealized. At the same time, small site infill offers major advantages. Projects can build faster and fit naturally into existing neighborhoods, requires no major infrastructure upgrade, and help delivering for missing middle housing and attainable starter homes that larger builder development often do not provide. I respectfully ask the city and the councils to take small site development into consideration and explore a scale fee framework for parcel under ½ acre or even under 1 acre. Supporting small site infill is one of the most efficient paths for the city to have meaningful increased housing supply on the existing neighborhoods, especially for starter homes and gentle density housing types that align with the city's goal. And in Alpha, we're doing more than 60 units under construction this year, and then we have about 200 units in the pipeline. We're hoping to build more, and if there's more opportunity for us, we're happy to take on more jobs. Yeah, thank you.
Good morning. I'm Nevada Merriman. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy for Mid-Penn. I had the opportunity to present 3 years ago, so I first commend the city for circling back on this topic. And a little about Mid-Penn, we manage 14 properties. That's more than 1,200 homes. In addition to that, we have one project in the pipeline at VTA Capitol Station in South San Jose. And I appreciate the city's efforts to address the issue head-on, with the particular orientation that really there are some items that are within the city's control to change. And I want to also state that over the years we've made policy recommendations to the city, and when the time is right, staff has seen an opportunity and they've taken it. So very appreciative to that. In general, much of the report is confirmatory in that Mid-Penn's experience is in line with the findings, particularly true on the cost per unit findings. I want to focus my comments on the place where we could see the greatest impact. It's not addressed in the study, but I ask for consideration there. And we'd welcome the chance to discuss further areas. We'll provide some comments to staff in more detailed, particularly with respect to fee waivers, reductions, or deferrals, which we see as a major part of how the city of Sunnyvale and other local communities, the particular information presented here did not take into consideration that Sunnyvale, for instance, waives the fee 100% for park fees. And that acts in our financing as the exact same as a loan of that amount. So it's really powerful, and it allows us to be more competitive, if that's correct. So across our deals, I looked at everything that we've closed. It's more than 20 deals over the past 3 years. And what we see is that the study's findings are consistent with the city mentioning roughly 10% of the subsidy coming from the city. We see 15% coming from a combined city and county level of investment. We also see 18% on average from the state and over 50% from the federal government. So my comments are really about how do we get more competitive to go after that state funding, which then in turn unlocks the federal funding. So it would be an enhancement to the city's current approach to have some greater understanding about that and greater alignment. For every $1 of local investment, we raise about $6 of external capital. That's a ratio of about 6 to 1. $1 of the city go out and be able to find 6 additional dollars. And building that robust affordable housing pipeline depends on having a robust, predictable source of funds. That's dispersed on a schedule consistently for all sources, and that's really recognizing that we have a real business cycle that is outside of our control. For instance, the Mid-Penn property, the VTA Capital Station, looks to be competitive for the state financing affordable housing sustainable communities program, which comes from Cap and Trade. It was a big part of the newspaper, that particular negotiation, $800 million a year. It's probably the only sure thing in affordable housing right now to go after that, and so cross your fingers. We don't tempt fate, but we hope any day now that we will see bringing a significant level of investment to the city. And the city's working to consider this and potentially enhance how competitive we are before we try to go into the state administers federal money, basically tax credits, tax-exempt bonds. So they start that competition cycle in February. So we have the risk, which is consistent of all of our community partners, that somehow we miss getting an award. You know, we get bumped by a council cycle, we get one day too late, and then we have to miss out on February altogether. Then we have another chance in the spring and another in the summer. But we want to make sure that we have all the bites at the apple, and because we can't exactly predict when we're going to hit, but we want to go in as strong as possible when we can. The current policy trends towards the city being the last in money. I will share that everybody wants to be the last in, and so that's not possible for everyone to be the last in. And I would say, excuse me. Really, you know, what this comes down to, connected to your study, is that delays in us being able to start construction because of the lack of alignment of all the funding sources needed, it results in cost because we have to then budget for this uncertainty. So do we know, if we don't think the project's going to be able to be competitive till April because we haven't received the city funding relative to February, when do we think we're going to start? Is it going to be 12 months later, 18 months later? Most of the state's competitions are front-loaded throughout the year, so you get into no man's land right about now, and that costs money. So construction, there's no contractor that holds their pricing for us. They say they love us, but they don't do it. There's no bank that can predict what the cost of their money is going to be. We've got to make sure after we get the tax credits that 6 months later we're able to close and we don't have to go back to anybody. So at the cost of tax credit application, one consideration is that there is this cost for escalation embedded in there. And you know, if you're able to get it all aligned under the stars, you won't need that, so it would bring your costs down. There's another cost as well, though. The cost is that we aren't bringing the homes online as fast as we can. So that's your societal cost of either locking up your money more than you want to or continuing to see some homes not come online. So last but not least, the federal government, with their One Big Beautiful Bill, doubled tax credits. It's a tax credit. That's the biggest public policy tool that they have to incentivize the development of low-income housing. And it's unprecedented. I've been going to DC for 8 years advocating for this. You don't see tax bills happen very often. And with that, it means that California, they predict, is going to be able to fund about 200,000 more homes. So that's an increased bond volume cap that's significant. They're going to try to push about twice as many deals through the system. I'd urge the city to look at that and consider how we can be ready. Not everybody is going to be ready. This all just happened. February is if you can be competitive, it's a great time to go in. And the city really plays that critical role. The existing tax credit pipeline within the city, if it's not competitive for state sources, it has this predictable outcome of leaving money on the table for the city. So the staff has pursued enhancements, and we hope that they will continue to pursue enhancements, and very grateful for a talented crew that's digging in with us as we speak in real time. So thank you.
Thank you, Nevada. Andrea Osgood, Chief of Real Estate for Eden Housing. Very similar to MidPenn, we are a nonprofit, have been around for 57 years, and we own 13 properties and over 1,100 homes in the city of San Jose. I want to thank you for doing this studying and paying attention to this important issue, and for implementing past suggestions from previous studies, such as allowing affordable housing developers to move forward with other bond issuers on projects. That's a real cost savings and has helped many projects move forward. I wanted to share some good news about an Eden property in San Jose that is in our pipeline, sort of hitting on many of the policy points that Nevada very eloquently laid out, but with a story of a project in your community. So some of you may know that Eden has partnered with the county on the East Santa Clara Avenue project that is at the old San Jose Medical Center site that's owned by the county in District 3. And we were selected by the county along with CORE to complete a campus that includes 3 affordable projects. The initial phase is going to be 68 units, senior units by Eden Housing. And we're happy to report that we just got word last week on Thursday that we are getting pulled off the wait list for 9% credits and have to turn around really quickly and accept those on Wednesday from the state. So super huge and exciting news for us. And the project. And this project has pretty typical costs as discussed and detailed in the study before you. And the city is providing about $7.8 million in financial support, both in fee waivers and a loan. Thank you very much. This represents about 14% of the total capital stack, and county resources cover another 20% plus the land. And then tax credits, 40%. So the tax credits, you can see, are a really important part of our capital stack. And as Nevada noted, tax credits are, in addition to being this incredible resource, the changes at the federal level mean that there are going to be more available nationally. So with that in mind, I would sort of encourage and echo what Nevada said, which is do as much as you can to sync the city NOFA process with state funding cycles. Both the city's soft gap funding, or not the city, but the state's super NOFA program, which is soft money for projects that need additional gap financing and aren't ready to move forward to the tax credit phase. So that's like the cap and trade dollars, and the tax credit rounds. The tax credit rounds are for those that have all of your gap financing ready and you want to just get that last tranche. This will help leverage the city's dollars to better compete for these critical resources, which, as I noted, cover up to 40% of a project's total cost. For our East Santa Clara project, the city's funding cycle was a little bit off this past summer and was not ideally timed for that tax credit application. And even though we had indications that the project would score really well, we didn't have an official word in time for the TCAC application for the tax credits. But thankfully, we were able to work out an interim solution with the Housing Accelerator Fund to make that application instead and proceed on a bridge funding commitment. So without that somewhat unique partnership, we would have had to wait another 6 months to apply again, potentially adding additional costs and escalation, financing costs and carry, et cetera. So I just wanted to provide that very real example, but we're very excited about the partnership with the city to bring these units online and many more in future years. Thank you very much.
So with that, we now open it up for questions and answers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate both the reports on market rate and affordable housing, the very data-rich understanding of what's going on in those markets, and specifically in San Jose vis-a-vis other cities, and then of course hearing from our market rate and affordable industry experts offers some additional context that's really valuable. I'll offer just a couple of comments and then turn it over to colleagues. This is, as I mentioned, foundational to our success as a city. One of our 5 focus areas is building more housing, and cost of construction, particularly relative to the rents that we can get in our market, has become the single most significant barrier. In fact, I was kind of shocked to look at the HCD data, which of course we report to them, but they've got a nice dashboard for it. Between 2020 and 2024, so most recent 5 years that have been completed, we entitled 21,993 multifamily units, almost 22,000 units in those 5 years. It's a pretty substantial number, but just about 7,000 have pulled building permits, so a little less than a third, which I think points to, it's not that we aren't zoning for housing or saying yes to housing. In fact, I think as far as I can recall, this council has ultimately said yes to every housing project that's come before us in my time here, as far as I can recall. But fewer than a third are securing the financing they need to actually put a shovel in the ground and build the much-needed housing that they desire to build. So I think the presentation's covered everything. One thing I did just want to highlight is, and this was mentioned in the first part of the presentation, I want to thank this council for making the bold decision to approve the multifamily housing incentive late last year that, as we had hoped and sort of modeled out, did allow groundbreakings this year on over 2,000 units that were on the bubble. Because as was pointed out, it's not binary, it's a spectrum, and there are projects for a variety of reasons, land costs or whatever else, that are kind of along a cost spectrum. And when we reduced our fees, or some would say right-sized our fees through the multifamily housing incentive, we saw 5 different projects totaling just over 2,000 units move forward this year. So thank you to colleagues for being responsive to that market data. And I highlight that because, one, while we don't have the ability to meet our goals in the housing element unilaterally, it's not something we can just vote on and make happen, it's really the market. We can create conditions and at the margins have a real impact. And in January, we'll have a number of policies coming back to this council that really get at the heart of at least our part of the cost of construction, including the inclusionary ordinance, the multifamily housing incentive once again, and then the downtown high-rise incentive, none of which on their own will guarantee housing, but contribute to creating that overall environment. Okay, so I think that was about all I wanted to say. I did just want to comment on the really thoughtful memo from our colleague, Councilmember Campos. I want to thank her and her team for putting this forward. As I think folks know, we did not agendize action, and generally at both budget study sessions and these study sessions don't agendize action taking because they're mainly for learning and asking questions and having discussion. But I think it's a great conversation starter. Many of these are items that really warrant further analysis, some of which I think have been previously directed, but it's worth reading. I think it's all good content. I will note on Rec 4 that we eliminated parking minimums, which I didn't hear reference today, but that I think was a big step and a bold step. I think we were the first big city in the country to eliminate parking minimums. So at some point, would love to hear more about how that's going. It doesn't seem to have completely changed the equation, but it's every little bit helps, as will single stair, which we recently talked about, and we'll see what that analysis comes back with. So we won't be able to take action today, but I think it is a good conversation starter, and just wanted to thank Councilmember Campos for the memo and recognize that it's on the agenda for everyone. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna turn to colleagues for questions and comments, and if my screen will cooperate, we will start with Councilmember Campos.
Thank you, Mayor. And I want to begin by really thanking staff, the consultants, and everyone in the box who participated and helped prepare us for this cost of residential development study. As we know, previous studies have concluded that there are certain types of multifamily buildings that aren't financially feasible in San Jose, and I look forward to, as the mayor alluded, upcoming policy decisions that will help us improve the feasibility of high-density housing in our city. I do have one question, because this conversation is really important in the context of the inclusionary housing ordinance that's coming to council next month, and I'm curious about how the study analyzes the impact of the inclusionary housing in lieu fee. Can we please get clarification if the study also analyzes the financial impact of constructing the inclusionary units at the AMIs required in the inclusionary housing ordinance? So not just the in lieu fee, but the actual construction. What does the analysis of that financial impact look like in this study?
So thank you, Councilmember, for the question. So the analysis didn't get into any specific single programmatic impacts on either the affordable side or the market rate side. So it doesn't speak to your question regarding what is the impact of inclusionary housing, like in lieu fees. We didn't get into that type of analysis. This really much focused on what is the world of cost factors that are driving residential development. It didn't speak specifically to programmatic requirements or whether or not those programmatic requirements had a direct causal link to the cost of development.
Thank you for that response. We know that the actual construction of inclusionary units is different from paying an in lieu fee. And so having that financial impact to the project not having been analyzed leaves us with some unknowns. And so I encourage my colleagues to think about the information that we're going to need to make policy decisions that are necessary to improve the financial feasibility of multifamily housing. And at a minimum, future studies should include sensitivity analysis that help us better understand the impact of various parking ratios. We know that we have eliminated parking and also as a city have a public transit first policy. And so including that, the impact of reducing the time that it takes for projects to go through the development review process. As we heard this morning, there's a lot of opportunity in this study to understand the different types of housing, as we heard small site infill development as well. It's all critical information for us to really think about how we're going to address the feasibility of housing at next year's meetings. And the memo that I've added into the record, I will be resubmitting to the Rules Committee for consideration. So thank you again for answering my questions.
Great, thanks, Councilmember, appreciate it. Let's go to Councilmember Tordillos.
Thank you, Mayor, and I also want to start by just thanking Councilmember Campos for her very thoughtful memo here. Some of the questions that she highlighted are things that I raised when we saw the last 2023 Cost of Development Survey before the Planning Commission, particularly kind of looking at these smaller scale infill housing opportunities. And I think that's an important one to look at moving forward, just because it ties into some existing city policy work streams, things like our missing middle housing policy, our small multifamily housing ordinance that'll be coming back to council in the next couple of years, and some of the ongoing things like the general plan 4-year update, where we'll be looking at what neighborhoods make sense to zone for that additional capacity. So understanding the cost profiles of that type of infill development, I think, would be really valuable. You know, we heard from Alpha X that they're looking at, even if they're doing kind of starter homes or townhome development, that they're very different in scale. The cost structures are different for these types of projects. So I think that's important to incorporate into the city's understanding, and also just highlighting the way that single stair might change some of the economics here, one way or the other. I was looking at just a couple example projects from Seattle. And you see things like for sale condos that are single stair on very small lots. So you could see something like a 10-unit condo complex on less than 1/7 of an acre, you know, very different from the for sale typologies that we studied here, all the way down to the very high density small lot infill possibilities. There are projects that are 20 units on 1/10 of an acre, or even smaller sites in Seattle using single stair. So there you start to get to densities that are higher than the tower scenario studied downtown, but on really small infill sites. So I think we could probably just expect that the economics of these types of housing would be different. So we'd be curious in future versions of this study to dig into that a little bit more, see if there's anything that could just shape the council's thinking in terms of forward-looking policymaking. I had a couple questions really quickly. One was just for staff, helping me to better understand something that I thought was interesting between the breakdown for podium versus wrap. I thought that it was interesting that, you know, those two typologies, we were looking at the same FAR, the same density, the same amount of parking, but with the wrap structure 2 stories shorter. So is it just the case that that would basically mean that the lot coverage would be higher in the wrap versus the podium typologies?
Yeah, the wrap is generally a lower density. You can't achieve the high density because of the configuration of the building. It tends to be a little cheaper to build on a per square foot basis, but the trade-off is you need a bigger site to make it work. So there's a minimum size for a wrap that you would need to have for the site, and for a podium, you could typically actually squeeze that on a pretty small site if you need to, but you can't do that for a wrap.
Okay, so in the table that was in the study where they kind of had everything being equal, that was just kind of for the purpose of comparison?
It was apples to apples comparison, yes, they're correct.
Gotcha, thank you. And the next question here is just, it was interesting, I think potentially slightly different from the last cost of development study that we saw, was that some of the lower density for sale typologies that we looked at, townhome stacked flats, showed actually being kind of potentially market feasible. So question here is just, if we think that there's this housing typology out there that actually pencils out, you know, why are we not seeing more of that type of housing get built in the current market? Do we have any guesses?
Well, I can tell you that Bay Area-wide, those are being built a fair amount. I don't know enough about San Jose's unique circumstances in today's market to say why you haven't seen more townhomes being built here. It could be a variety of factors. Financing is probably my guess. It might be site availability and zoning, but maybe Eric can weigh in on that.
Thank you. And I guess to Josh's point, you know, if it is the case that our neighboring cities can get, you know, 20% higher rents or significantly higher sale values, given the limited resources of some of our developers, they might just be focusing development opportunities on our neighboring peers.
Yeah.
That seems like a logical explanation because the money's going to follow the highest return. So.
Yeah, that's exactly what I want to add on. I think a lot of builders, they will choose a higher sales price or higher rent price cities. So with the same construction costs, where similar construction costs and even lower fees, they probably will choose other cities instead of San Jose. But we want to build more in San Jose. So. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question I had was potentially for either, maybe for Josh. One thing that I've heard from some of our partners in development before is just this notion that some of the other requirements that the city has also imposes costs. Things like our design standards, things like daylight plane requirements, facade articulation and material requirements, you know, private open space and balcony requirements in new development. Curious from your experience if you view any of that that wasn't necessarily directly studied here as having any potential for cost improvements?
Yes. So those are the unknown things, right? That aren't like a specific fee that's super black and white, and it's nebulous as you go through the planning process. I'm less concerned about like the exterior skin or balcony requirements and things like that. A big kind of open box is off-site improvements. So like the city has a lot of different vision plans for different corridors, streetscape plans that are, Public Works manages these master plan projects for boulevards and all these different things, future bike lanes, really great vision projects for the city. And there's also, so in addition to that, implementing those types of things, there's, unknowns that before you break ground or before you go through your entitlement process of like what other things might come up, new street lights, other things that could be multi-millions of dollars and cost impacts, but it's unknown out of the gate. And so I think being able to have a tighter control on that process, working with if the developer is like the client of the city, or the customer going through the process, trying to have a better handle on those sort of offsite costs.
Thank you, that's very helpful. And I know Councilmember Campos' memo also directed looking at some of the offsite improvement costs there. So I think good to just kind of maybe zoom out, have a wider lens here, whether we're looking at design standards, offsite costs, other elements that are in the city's control. Just trying to understand, is that 2% of costs? Is it 10% of costs? What is kind of being left on the cutting room floor there? And then one final question quickly just for staff. Both of our market rate developers here mentioned, some concerns about just current fee structures, being based per unit versus, per square footage or per bedroom. Is there any existing city workstream that's looking at kind of that angle of potentially tweaking some of the city's requirements?
Yes, so there is a work stream that's looking at those requirements and then a global sort of impact that's being done with housing PBCE within the CED work group and looking at overall kind of fee structures within the city as well.
Amazing, thank you.
Thanks, Councilmember. Appreciate all the thoughtful questions. Let me turn to Vice Mayor Foley.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation and covering all aspects of development, whether it be affordable, market rate, small infill. It was really a helpful analysis as we go forward. Councilmember Tordillos, I appreciate all of your questions and your analysis. Clearly, your Planning Commission experience is really going to be helpful on these issues as we go forward, and I look forward to a real in-depth discussion when we discuss all of these specifics in January as to what we can do and what we can't do. Really, I just wanted to invite everybody. One of the focus areas that we have at the city is building more housing, and that falls under the purview of the CED committee. And on Monday, we will be getting a presentation on building more affordable housing in connection with our focus group. So I know there's 5 council members here who will be at that meeting, but if you want to watch and see what continues the discussion there, that might be helpful too. It's 1:30 on Monday. I just wanted to extend that invitation. And really, you've given us so much to think about, and it's important that we consider all ways that we can really get out of the way of development and create more development, all types of development in the city of San Jose, thereby bringing the cost and bringing the affordability up and allowing more people to rent. Josh, I really appreciated your comment about the average tech employee and wanting them to be renting in a Class A type building and not a Class B or C, because that puts pressure on the affordable housing projects. So the more of the Class A, the more market rate we can build, the more that opens it up for those who can afford lower rents can only pay affordable rents to live there. So I think that's something that we should all be keeping in mind. Also, the effect of foreclosures on the real estate market and the financing capability. I was also happy to hear, I guess, that the construction costs have stabilized, because we hear that that's one of the reasons that the cost of construction is, cost of development is so high in San Jose, is because of the cost of construction is going off. But if it's stabilized, that's all over the county or all over our area too. It's really the it's really the rent is really what's causing the offset between cost of development, because it looks like, all things being equal, in the Bay Area, costs are the same, but the rent that you could generate in our surrounding neighborhoods or surrounding jurisdictions is higher. So not much we can do with that unless we build more and cause more affordability. And of course, financing pieces, the banks, the tax incentives all depend on whether you can turn some sort of profit or generate an income from it. So I appreciate the conversation, really complicated, but it was really useful to hear. Thank you.
Thanks, Vice Mayor. Appreciate those reflections. Councilor Casey?
Yeah, Vice Mayor's comment spurred a question. So the comps that we used in terms of market rate and the discrepancy and how we're much lower or not much lower is a reflection of the location decision of folks wanting to be living near the tech centers and job centers, I would imagine. So unless we bring more jobs and tech jobs here into San Jose and or make this a fun, viable place to live, which we as a council members can have an impact on, I think those are two levers we need to concentrate on pulling. So just a parenthetical comment there. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate that. It really is both sides of the equation. Let me go to Councilmember Mulcahy.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to my colleagues. I really have a lot of alignment with what I've heard from each of you, so thank you, and thanks for the report and the study session today. Just wanted to raise one kind of tiny piece in this larger discussion. I think it was Jason, when you were kind of walking us through kind of the lead up to the bulk of the presentation, you sort of went to the townhomes and sort of said, oh, you've kind of got that covered. I just want to make sure we're not forgetting the fact that we're trying to improve the entire continuum. And if there are opportunities, even in those, you know, even a townhome product type that we're doing presumably well in, and I think, you know, there's data to support that we're doing okay because there's more permits pulled than units built. Want to make sure we're not overlooking those opportunities where even if we are doing well, how can we continue to build on that momentum that we have? So thanks again for the report.
Okay, not seeing any other hands. Just before we turn to public comment, I would ask about a really radical idea, which is, are we seeing any discussion in Sacramento about property tax abatement or some other more kind of radical moves that might enable more housing to be feasible? I think we'd, you know, even if we considered it, probably hesitate to go alone as a city. We're only 14 cents on the dollar, but if you were to include even a short period of abatement, including county and state, you'd really change the equation. But is there any discussion of that?
I was going to mention, there's always been like background talks about like redevelopment agency 2.0 type things. I haven't heard anything on the state level, like as far as a global incentive program for housing in the state. That being said, when I mentioned it earlier, I was not given the timing of everything and that the city's hell-bent on producing housing, I wasn't recommending that we go down a state discussion path just from a timing perspective, but even looking at just the city and our colleagues at the county, just combining that portion of the property tax would make a huge impact on return on costs. This is especially for high rises, I'm thinking. Also work for multifamily, but you know, cost is, so construction costs, hard costs, the development costs. lowering that, like if, let's say, a certain percentage, it has a certain impact on the return, but when you lower the operating, when you either increase rents or lower the operating expenses, that has like a crazy higher impact on that return on cost. It's so, you'd be shocked how sensitive the models are. When we're going through and like, okay, can we shave costs here? And then we shave like $1 million off, figure out something here, and then it doesn't move that needle. And then, okay, what about if we lower our operating expenses or like project that we're gonna have a little bit higher rents, and that like really pushes the return on cost. And it's that metric that the banks use to figure out if they're gonna fund the project, and then third-party equity groups. So it is a big lever. We haven't used it or looked at it in the city. I'd always suggest stuff like incremental property tax. So whatever the city and the county is collecting today on the current vacant lot or single-story building stays the same. It's just the incremental for a period of time.
Right. Nevada?
Hi there. I would just add, I lead state legislative advocacy for Mid-Penn, so the bill numbers change every year, but this episodically comes up every couple of years. It's a 2-year bill cycle, tends to die in the first year.
Yeah.
But it's really a great thing to consider because, as my colleague here mentioned, there's not a lot that cities can do to incentivize kind of in that middle, that missing middle housing. So things like adding density, getting cost out of the project in other ways, and then looking at this are really kind of the top handful of tools that you have available to you. So,
thanks for that.
And I just wanted to add that there are, on the property taxes, right, that is an ongoing operating cost, as Josh mentioned, right? That's a very big part of how lenders will lend to a project. And what we see more and more across the country are, while the property tax doesn't go away, and it's certainly not going to be something that Sacramento is like waiving for, a lot of projects, right? What we see a lot of are these efforts to do where a city agency or a housing authority or some public agency, right, can help create, make a project feasible, not by subsidizing it directly, but by playing an ownership role that allows those property taxes to be waived or minimized, so that those operating costs go down quite a lot, and it makes a huge difference in what is feasible. And so we're seeing that a lot as a way to address the missing middle, combine market rate with some affordable or 50-50 or different combinations that make sense and can bring more units online through that approach. And there are a lot of different structures that are doing that now.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Just given, Josh, did I hear you correctly in the earlier presentation that property taxes are nearly half of your operating expenses? That's wild.
Yes.
And I referenced the state only because 2/3 of the property tax take is state, and the most of that comes back down to school districts. City and county combined, I believe, are about 32%, which is meaningful, but only about 1/3. Okay, well, there's some good food for thought there. I also just want to highlight at the state level, Assemblymember Buffy Wicks, who's been a real champion on housing, just created, really the Assembly created, she'll be chairing a new committee on innovation in construction, looking at, which we should all be paying attention to, methods of bringing down costs just through innovation. So interesting to think about. Just before we go to public comment, I think we've got Councilmember Tordillos for another comment.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Just wanted to plus one your comment on the property tax angle there. I grew up in Washington State, so I've followed kind of some of their legislative work over the years. And I think it's interesting that they have this kind of shorter-term general tax abatement, specifically just to encourage multifamily housing development, but they also have this longer-term abatement that applies to inclusionary units that kind of scales with the number of units and the affordability level of those units. So we obviously have the IHO update coming up soon. I think it's interesting to look at what other states have done to try to offset some of the costs associated with building on-site affordable units. And given that we have a state legislature that has been taking bolder housing actions recently, could be a good opportunity to revisit some of the statewide angles here and potentially incorporate it into our legislative program for next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for flagging that. All right, it is just after 11:30. How many comment cards do we have?
8.
8. All right then, let's do it.
Okay, when I call your name, go ahead and come on down. The first person to the microphone, just go ahead and start speaking. The other people can line up behind them. Hadia Fain, Allison Singalani, Alex Seawick, and Ali Sapperman to start. You have, oh, I emailed this to them already, so they do have copies. Sure, we'll hand them out. So she's got the annual reports that we'll give you after the meeting.
I was just I'm gonna reference something in
Okay.
the annual report.
Okay.
All right, you may begin.
Good morning. My name is Hadia Fain, and I represent Life Services Alternatives. Before I make my comment, and I know I don't have much time, I do want to say thank you, and I want to commend this governing body for this city for your consideration for this study, and also Matt. I was dear friends with Sam and Jessica, and I know why he picked you. I appreciate your transparency and all that you're doing for the city, and personally for my family. So thank you. I'll make my story short. They're passing around annual reports right now. On page 3 of that annual report, you'll see the history of Life Services Alternatives, which I'm calling LSA. And we provide housing, and we provide programs for adults with developmental disabilities. So as much as I'm in awe of all of you, I'm not here on my own behalf right now. I'm here because of people who cannot speak for themselves. They can't do much for themselves, as a matter of fact. We started LSA in 2002 at what's now known as Rivermark, and it was property and government land. That property has been a space for affordable housing, for senior housing, and then of course for the individual we serve, as well as for single-family affordable units. It also happens to be with intention on the property of, or directly next to Oracle's parking lot. And in addition to that, it's across the street from a Safeway. In addition to that, it's been built up around the lands, and I don't want to bore you with the details. Many people know about Rivermark and know about that property. What they don't know is that this is the genesis of our organization, and since then, we've been able to open 16 more homes to house many, many more.
Thank you. That's your time. Next speaker.
Please listen to this. Give them what they want, please.
Thank you. That's your time. I'd also like to call down Kira and Rigo. Come on down.
Allison Singalani, Director of Policy at SV at Home. We appreciate the city's commitment to strengthening San Jose's housing policies and agree that thoughtful updates can help us move closer to a future where everyone has access to a safe and stable home through increased housing production. To get there, it's essential that we ground improvements in transparent data, robust analysis, and deep engagement with community members and partners across the housing ecosystem. These tools allow all of us to make decisions with clarity, confidence, and shared purpose. As we reviewed the cost of residential development study, we saw a valuable starting point, but also an opportunity. The decisions you're called upon to make will shape the daily lives of thousands of San Jose's residents, and our community deserves an approach that is rooted in full and clear understanding of what is needed to make housing more affordable and attainable. This study can better equip Council to navigate important decisions ahead with more comprehensive data and analysis shaped to support these specific decisions. We appreciate that the Rules Committee recognized this need by unanimously voting to delay consideration of proposed changes to the Inclusionary Housing Ordinance until after today's study session. Because proposed changes are tied to development feasibility, it's crucial that feasibility for inclusionary housing units themselves, not just in lieu fees, across income levels, be analyzed in a transparent and complete way. Without that, we risk making changes without knowing if they'll achieve our shared goals or unintentionally limit affordability. In the coming months, you'll consider updates to several key policies, including inclusionary housing ordinance, mobile home ordinance, downtown high-rise incentive program, tenant utility pass-through, in the city budget process. These pieces are interconnected and require a holistic approach that models how changes might interact, centering the experiences of San Jose's residents most impacted by the housing crisis. We're committed to working alongside you, together with our community partners and residents, to build a stronger, more equitable San Jose. We believe deeply in what's possible.
Thank you. Thank you. That's your time. Next speaker.
Good morning. My name is Allie Saperman. I want to thank council, staff, and the providers that are here today. I'm here on behalf of the Housing Action Coalition, and we represent members of different industry groups between like land use consultants, developers, architects, labor unions like the carpenters. And we want to see the highest amount of fees that are financially feasible for development. There's lots of fees that provide uncertainty, and it's important to streamline projects so that there is less uncertainty and inevitably less fees. Councilmember Tordillos asked why condos aren't being built. This is largely due to some loopholes like condo defect liability. We're actually working on a state fix like right to repair. I know Mayor Mahan brought up the idea of tax abatement. We're actually working on this as well. SB 336 was a bill that the Housing Action Coalition ran last year. It's going to be a 2-year bill, and it expands the welfare tax exemption for affordable housing to include moderate income units up to 120% AMI. So it's just a part of the solution, but a big piece of the conversation that we haven't talked about today is potentially supporting the statewide housing bond, which we expect to see. It'll be a great revolving fund for our affordable providers, because if we are adjusting inclusionary, we would need to make sure the affordable housing is still getting built. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker. Also Harvey and Dan, come on down.
Good morning. My name is Alex Siwak. My wife and I have owned a parcel in San Jose in District 2 for the last 40 years. We're in the process of going through the planning for 72 single-family homes, each to include an ADU. I've sent you our sort of chronology in the last 6 months yesterday, and this morning I sent you what I would interpret Governor Newsom's approach to his AB 130 that came into effect at the end of June. So what we really need is a chaperone, a liaison person, a intermediary, a special master. 3 months ago, our $700 an hour land use attorney sent an explanation of why our project is AB 130 eligible, which exempts us from CEQA. We've yet to receive a response. 2 weeks ago, we got a word salad explaining why scratchings from here and scratchings from there don't apply to make our project CEQA exempt. We really would like somebody, an adult, to help mediate these issues. In the explanations I sent over the last 2 days, it's clear we are AB 130 exempt. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Hello, I'm Kira Kazantzis from Silicon Valley Council of Nonprofits and also representing the Real Coalition. As you likely know, the coalition sent a letter asking for certain data, certain analysis and engagement, which I will not reiterate here. I do have a couple of notes. You know, San Jose has been reasonably successful at compared to other cities in the region at developing affordable units at very low cost per unit to the city. And this begs the question of how to continue or enlarge that trajectory without Measure E, Measure A, or potentially in lieu IHO fees to provide the needed financial support to ensure project feasibility. Given, and also, given that feasibility of higher density development depends on rents rising substantially, the city's comprehensive plan for the housing needs of low-income folks is clearly more important than ever. We do support Councilmember Campos's memo, and I also want to thank specifically Director Sullivan for offering another context for deeper community education and engagement for our nonprofit coalitions and the communities we serve. Related to the cost of development and specifically its connection to IHO policy, and we look forward to that deeper engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, also Julian, come on down.
Buenos dias, Mayor Mahan and City Council. My name is Rigo Gallardo. I'm a field representative with the NorCal Carpenters Union, Local 405 here in San Jose. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. The study before you makes something very clear. The city has real tools at its disposal to help get more housing built. Identifying city-controlled fees that can be waived is an important step, and we support using those tools to remove barriers and move projects forward. But the study also highlights another major challenge. Entitlement costs continue to be a significant burden for housing development. If we want homes built faster and at a cost that pencils out, then addressing those entitlement hurdles is essential. The Carpenters are ready to be partners in that work. We are prepared to collaborate with elected leaders and city staff on fee waivers and on streamlining entitlement processes. But we believe strongly that these incentives must be paired with fairness for the workforce that builds this housing. If developers receive financial relief and a faster path to approval, then the workers who bring these projects to life should share in those benefits through good wages, apprenticeship opportunities, and safe working conditions. San Jose has a chance to set the standard. Let's be the city where housing is approved efficiently, where building is financially achievable, and where every project is built by workers who are treated with dignity. By aligning incentives with strong labor standards, we can deliver housing that our community needs and good careers that our families can count on. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Hi, my name is Dan Mountseer. I'm a small builder in San Jose. I did want to echo what Alpha X indicated, as well as some other council members. Especially for the smaller infill site, yeah, the cost structure is considerably different when it's not a two-angle rectangle. When it's a smaller, oddly shaped thing like that, it changes things quite a bit. There's a lot of these sites, and a lot of them are currently blight. I think it is an opportunity that we need to take care of, because right now I think the numbers my civil engineer gave me was that there was like 110 entitled this year, 13 pulled permits, and 3 were completed. So obviously something needs to help to break them loose, and I would just encourage that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, also Mark, come on down.
Hi there, I'm Harvey McKeown with the NorCal Carpenters Union. I want to really thank the Housing Department for keeping us in the loop as a stakeholder regarding the study's development. And, you know, if there's ways that our union's research department can help refine any aspects of this analysis with our own industry insights and data, then our door always remains open. And fundamentally, we want to be helpful and a pragmatic voice in supporting ways to make housing development financially feasible in this city. That includes being a voice in support of things like fee waivers and exploring avenues for entitlement efficiencies, but only in a way that is fair and equitable to the local workforce. The reason this is important is because there's also a very human cost of residential development. And in recent months, labor compliance activity related to active housing construction in San Jose has uncovered multiple potentially egregious forms of labor exploitation. And there was at least one brave worker who came before council in recent months to stand here and speak to you about that upsetting experience. So while we are genuinely really willing to be a pragmatic voice in terms of supporting efforts to reduce development costs. We ask that this does not occur at workers' expense, and I'm sure we can find a way to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Good afternoon, Mayor and council members, and thank you for this study session examining the cost barriers that are facing multifamily housing in San Jose. My name is Julian Lake. I'm a San Jose resident, and I'm here on behalf of the Bay Area Council, which represents around 400 of the region's largest employers. Right now, we are seeing a troubling pattern. Even zone entitled and fully planned multifamily projects in San Jose and around the Bay Area are stalling because their costs exceed their financial benefits. According to a recent study by the Rand Corporation, it costs 2.3 times more to build an apartment in California than in Texas, and the leading reasons in their study are within the city's ability to influence. The authors point to California's high impact fees on housing, our uniquely expensive entitlement process, and our highly bespoke building code as leading reasons for this cost difference. Construction costs remain among the highest in the nation, but what really pushes projects over the edge are the soft costs and carrying costs embedded in our local development process. When you look at San Jose's pipeline, you see dozens of shovel-ready projects that cannot move forward, not because of lack of demand, but because every month of delay and every additional requirement increases risk and reduces feasibility. Some of these requirements are well-meaning, such as the requirement that developers build a certain share of their building as affordable, but these requirements effectively require the developer to lose money on large portions of their building, making it less feasible for them to build and, crucially, actually harming affordability for renters around the region. San Jose's impact fees are another part of the equation, and my request today is to apply the lessons that we've learned on reducing these fees citywide to multifamily housing. We need more housing to stabilize rents in general, and we hope that the Bay Area Council can be a partner in this work.
Thank you. That's your time. Next speaker.
I would like to recognize that the city has limited ability and powers. The state has overriding laws that we all have to follow, and the macroeconomy is nothing that we can flip a switch and fix. So we are working with two big constraints. What you do have is ability on your policies, and there's three areas I think the city could be very helpful on. One is fee deferrals. As my colleague at Urban Catalyst described, we have to pay for the impacts, and we're not arguing that, but what we are saying is, when do we pay? In order to build a high-rise, you must pay for 100% of the building before the first person moves in. By allowing the impacts to be deferred, the fees to be deferred later on in the process allows capital management for developers. It lowers our risk, and it doesn't impact the city because the building isn't done, nobody's using the services that we're being paid for, that we're being charged for. That's one area. The second one is process and clarity. We talk about time. I have 1 minute and 10 seconds. Time is what is risk. Time is what it takes to get a project through, and it creates uncertainty. Financing can fall through. Things can change. New building codes can come in and you have to redesign the project sometimes. Having very clear and working with your staff, who are professional, who know what they're doing, but to give them the tools to move projects faster through the process. And the third one is off-site improvements. It is a black box. If I can pay $1 million for an acre, but I have $1 million off-site improvement, I can't pay $1 million anymore. And not knowing that at the beginning of a project creates certain uncertainty and friction. And I say friction as just inefficiencies. So the three areas I think you guys could help us with is deferring fees until the impacts are felt in the city, 2, working with staff to have clear guidance and quick feedback, and 3, a little bit more transparency on the goals of off-site improvements. Thanks.
Back to council.
Great. Thank you again to those who put together the report, all of our expert panelists, staff, all our public commenters and colleagues for your close attention and great questions and comments. With that, we are adjourned. Happy holidays, everybody.